Time for the session to start. We are getting some logistics together for the presenter to get into the session. We did have a slight change, so just one moment when they get the person into the remote session to talk about our talk. If you go ahead and take a seat, we'll be getting started very momentarily. Are we good to go?
Can you hear me?
Scott, is that you?
That's me.
1 second. Great. Thank you. Looks like we got you connected. Thank you, everyone. If you could take your seats, we're going to go ahead and get started with the discussion, the talk today. We did have a change in speakers. Sean PEISERT was unavailable, and we have replacement Scott Russell. Scott is a senior policy analyst at the Indiana University of Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. Previous postdoctorate fellow with the Information Security Law and Policy, and he's been working with the Trusted Cybersecurity Framework since I think the inception. Scott, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you, and following, we'll have Q&A, I believe, at the end of your session. Thank you, everyone.
Great,
this is the again experiences and adoptions and implementation of the Trusted CI Framework. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon here in sunny Indiana. Stepping in at the last minute to cover for Sean PEISERT, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Trusted CI Framework, which is the program that I lead with Trusted CI, and particularly some of our recent experiences with NSF major facilities and their adoption and implementation of that framework. So I'm going to apologize in advance. I am, driving slides that I'm not 100% familiar with, but I'm hopefully like 80-85% familiar with. So there shouldn't be too many hiccups, I'm hoping. Just a very quick roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about today. First, I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background and motivation about why we're talking about the framework, why we developed a framework in the first place. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about cybersecurity programs. That's a term that we use a whole lot at Trusted CI, but is not used as frequently in the general cybersecurity space. Then I'm going to go on to talk about what the Trusted CI framework is, and then move on to those lessons that I mentioned before from the NSF community. So a couple of goals with the presentation today. The first, of course, is we want to advocate for a programmatic approach to cybersecurity, not a checklist compliance approach. We want to introduce the Trusted CI framework along with some of the related tools that we have developed to support the framework. I want to provide perspectives from the NSF community, right, which might be less familiar to some members of the audience. A general goal that we always have when we present is we want more framework adopters. As you're going to find out, adopting the framework is very easy, doesn't cost you anything, and we think it will actually substantially improve your cybersecurity posture, at least in the long term. And finally, we want to make sure to have some time to answer any questions that you might have. All right, so a little bit about the background for why we're talking about this. One, I am with Trusted CI. Trusted CI is the NSF Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. The Trusted CI fundamentally does cybersecurity for science. That is our mission. We are funded by the NSF. And science has some unique needs that warrant more than the traditional approach to cybersecurity. The missions in the science community are unique, right? They also tend to have complex environments, a lot of non-traditional technologies, we would call operational technology or OT. And also budgets tend to be more constrained in this space, although maybe that's a universal truth for the entire world. So within Trusted CI, we've been around since 2012. But our current strategic focus is on the National Science Foundation's major facilities. These are the largest scientific infrastructure investments that we make through the National Science Foundation. You can see some examples in the pictures on the slides. But these are the large telescopes. These are the Large Hadron Collider. When we do assessments of the ocean, we have these wide array of sensors in the ocean. Wide range of different projects, significant investments, a lot of unique needs, and our goal is to help these major facilities build cybersecurity programs. And as I mentioned, I'll talk a little bit more about what we mean when we talk about a cybersecurity program. Here's a list of the current NSF major facilities. This slide included here purely just to show you the range of technologies we're dealing with, right? We have ships, we have telescopes, we have sensors attached to the ground, wide range of different types of technologies being utilized here. Really interesting stuff. So a little bit more background before I get into the talking about the framework, which is going to be kind of like the thrust of this talk. Both within Trusted CI and also at my home institution at Indiana University at the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, we regularly conduct assessments, training, consultations, a wide range of engagements with a wide range of organizations. Obviously, the science community, the research and science communities are a focus of ours, but we have also engaged with the DoD, we've engaged with ports, private companies, pretty wide range of experience there. We also have a multidisciplinary background, which we always bring to bear when we're doing our engagements. And one of the things we found through this wide range of engagements is that the primary challenges that we find organizations are facing with regard to their cybersecurity are not the purely technical problems, right? It's not trying to implement specific controls, things like that. They tend to be on what we would characterize as programmatic elements. There will be problems with getting money to fund the controls that they need, or there will be problems with how cybersecurity is governed within the organization. There might just be a complete lack of leadership involvement in cybersecurity decision-making. And a lot of times cybersecurity is detached from the organization's overall mission. It's almost running in parallel and is not directly supporting the mission, which is what it fundamentally should be doing. So we found that a lot of the organizations we were engaging with have these fundamental problems, again, on the non-technical side of cybersecurity, and also that there wasn't good guidance out there to help them address these non-technical elements. So this is sort of forming the foundation for why we basically went out and developed our own framework designed to address some of these challenges we were seeing in practice. A little bit more on the motivation side, though. A lot of National Science Foundation projects anticipate some kind of cybersecurity compliance might be coming soon. It's kind of in the ecosystem right now. It's not totally clear what's going to happen, but there have been a lot of what you might call cybersecurity compliance regimes beginning to emerge. There is the Controlled Unclassified Information, or CUI, and the corresponding NIST 800-171. In the defense space, there is a Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. In the research space, there's the NSPM 33. And in some cases, FISMA, which is the cybersecurity requirements for the federal government and for some of the larger contractors. One of the things about a lot of these compliance control sets is that they tend to focus more on the technology, and they are not as fixated on the enablers of cybersecurity, which we would characterize as the governance, the resources. And another thing that we found is that without a cybersecurity program already in place, if you were to hand an organization one of these compliance control sets, they wouldn't really even know where to begin, right? They would be in over their head because it's just so complex and they don't have the fundamental architecture in place to even think about cybersecurity in these ways. So all of that is a backdrop for why we focus on cybersecurity programs. I think a little bit more before I get into the framework itself. So just very briefly, when we talk about a cybersecurity program, this is a definition that we've adopted from general project management, but it's a group of related activities managed in a coordinated way to obtain benefits that you would not be able to obtain from managing them individually. Key point that we always like to emphasize is that when we talk about cybersecurity programs, they are a part of a larger organization. They live as a part of that organization throughout its life cycle. So this is in contrast to a version of cybersecurity, which hopefully no one believes anymore, which is that it's just a couple of things you have to do and then you're done with it. You're never done with cybersecurity. It is an ongoing part of your organization's life. A couple things to note that a cybersecurity program is not. It's not just a plan. It's not a project that would have a completion date. And it's not just a set of controls that you are supposed to implement. A cybersecurity program is much more broader and more holistic than that. So why do we talk so much about cybersecurity programs? Well, one, cybersecurity is just too complex to handle as a compliance checklist kind of approach. It's dynamic, it's complex, it's multidisciplinary. Very importantly, it takes a long period of time often and a lot of resources to address competently. It's always going to be relevant throughout your organization's life cycle. And also, when you have a program in place, it supports a whole bunch of things that you wouldn't get from not taking a programmatic approach, right? It allows you to prioritize your efforts. So if you have a list of 100 controls you need to implement, which ones do you do first, right? You can't do them all at the same time. You're not going to get anything done. You might not be able to get them all done over the next 5 years. What are you going to try and do over that time period? You want to be able to prioritize. It also supports project management to actually implement those prioritizations that you made. And it explicitly talks about things that you don't see in other areas of cybersecurity, the communication, governance, accountability, and resourcing. Because fundamentally, you need cybersecurity to align to the mission. As I mentioned, I think briefly earlier, cybersecurity should not be a completely parallel track that's doing its own thing. It needs to be incorporated into the mission and support the mission. That's the goal of cybersecurity. If cybersecurity is not supporting the mission, it's not doing its job correctly. But also, you need people to do the cybersecurity work. That's something that's just not explicitly addressed if you just have controls. Who's going to actually do the work to implement those controls? Who's going to pay for the controls? And how are you going to set those priorities? How are you going to align what you are doing to what the organization actually wants? How are you going to evaluate success and failure? These are all programmatic considerations. All right, so with that kind of backdrop out of the way, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Trusted CI framework. The Trusted CI framework, this is a framework that we developed at Trusted CI to establish a minimum standard for cybersecurity programs. And we do really mean a minimum standard. These are things that we think if you do not have this in place, you will have fundamental problems. But if you do have all of these in place, then you have the foundation to make competent cybersecurity decisions throughout your organization's life cycle. It consists of 16 clear and concise requirements. Each one is technically just a sentence, but we unpack them in much greater detail. This is not something that we just pulled out of the air. We tried to base this to the extent we could on best practices, evidence of what works, our history of engagement with the NSF science community. Despite being designed with this community in mind, it is fundamentally universal and timeless. It applies to all organizations. If you need a cybersecurity program, then the Trusted CI framework would be helpful for you. And timeless because it is not shackled to any particular technical standard or technology. All of the things we're talking about are programmatic fundamentals. When we talk about programmatic fundamentals, we have, again, the 16 clear and concise requirements. We will often generalize them into what we call pillars. These are mission alignment, making sure cybersecurity actually aligns to the mission. Again, something I've emphasized a couple of times already. Governance, actually how you manage cybersecurity. Resources, how you fund the cybersecurity. And then the controls element, which is often what most people typically think of when they think of cybersecurity. Despite controls being a part of our framework, this is not a long list of technical requirements, right? This is not NIST SB 800-171 or any of those kinds of documents that are more focused on the technical side. We are, again, focused on the programmatic side. Just a very quick overview. I'm not going to walk through all of the musts in detail, but this is available on our website. This is just a one-pager that shows the 16 musts. For a couple of examples that I think will help exemplify what we're talking about, must 7 says you should have a lead role with to advise the organization on cybersecurity, or someone in charge of cybersecurity, essentially. And in must 12, it says you have to have a cybersecurity budget, right? These are pretty basic programmatic considerations. So there's a lot of frameworks out there. Why should you use this one? One of the things we always like to emphasize when talking about our framework as compared to some of the other ones out there is that this one is very doable. A lot of cybersecurity, particularly if you're not a veteran in the field, can be very overwhelming. Ours, we try very hard to make sure it is not that way. Part of that is because we don't go deep into the technical weeds. We focus on the programmatics, which are understandable often at a higher level and without as deep of a background in the field. But also because it is fundamentally a minimum standard. Like I said, this is what we think is the bare minimum. Each one of these elements, therefore, becomes increasingly important, right? Because if you don't do all 16, then there is a gap in your program that could lead to fundamental problems. But additionally, why should you use this framework? It's fundamentally designed to support your mission. This is something that a lot of other frameworks that is not, a primary consideration. You see a lot of checkbox compliance, whether intended or not by other frameworks. It tends to devolve into that. And ours fundamentally is designed to support your mission. Our very first must, must number one is, align your cybersecurity program to the organization's mission. And throughout all of the framework, there is a lot of flexibility to allow you to make the framework work for your mission. Mentioned before, but is built based on our experience, our on-the-ground experience engaging with this community. And it is designed to address many of the common barriers that we have seen to effective programs. It was overseen by stakeholders from across the community. So we established a group called the Framework Advisory Board, which has members from a wide range of institutions, higher ed, NSF major facilities, DOE labs. There's a good range of people in there. And they provide input and feedback both on the development of the framework and also on the strategic direction that the framework will take into the future. Another point that I think is always important to emphasize is that doing our framework will actually enable the rest of your cybersecurity efforts. That includes other frameworks, other compliance regimes. If you have to do, if you have to manage controlled unclassified information, our framework will actually help you do that because it'll put in place those programmatic fundamentals that will then allow you to implement the 100-some controls that are required there. And a final point we always like to emphasize is that because we're not talking about technical controls, the types of requirements that we are emphasizing are much more understandable to a lot of organizational leadership, and therefore it's easier to get buy-in for your cybersecurity program rather than the specifics of individual cybersecurity controls. Common question you might hear, I addressed this a little bit already, but what if I'm already using another framework? Well, one will say, not an issue. There's no potential conflict between our framework and any other frameworks that we've ever encountered, and we think we know them all. It's also not an excuse, because ours does something different. So, number one, our framework will actually aid implementation. So, doing our framework will help you with any other cybersecurity you have to do. As I mentioned, there are no conflicts with any of the other main frameworks out there. You can absolutely do both. Most importantly, though, it closes gaps because our framework is just targeted at something different than what a lot of others are doing, and this will help you close potential gaps that you might have. And finally, it's very easily incorporated. So if you are already doing cybersecurity well, then you can adopt our framework and do a quick little check through and say, you know what, we're actually doing pretty good. Don't have to overhaul our existing efforts. And I apologize, I realize it looks like some of the slides are getting clipped down at the bottom. Hopefully you're able to see everything there okay. A couple other things that the framework offers, and before I actually go into a little bit more detail about it, we explicitly talk about strategic planning. This is something I'll come back to when I talk about the Framework Cohort, group engagement that we've been conducting over the past year. Emphasizes leadership communication. It actually gives you tools to better communicate with leadership. If you are, in this case, a cybersecurity practitioner, it has a lot of flexibility to adapt to your mission. It is not rigid in any way. We try to make it as flexible as possible while still ensuring that the fundamentals are actually being met. Mentioned several times already, but explicit focus on mission, and also the explicit discussion of resourcing. This is something that a lot of frameworks and control sets, they don't really want to talk about the money part of things, but we think it is critical to talk about money. It's driving everything else that we do. And as a bonus, again, it's a little bit cut off on these slides, but we're not going to tell you which controls to implement. This is we're not going to tell you how to implement your controls. We're not going to tell you what order to implement your controls. We can do that. Trusted CI, we do lots of engagements other than purely on the framework side of things. But from a archetypal Trusted CI framework perspective, we are not going to take that into account. So you are free to pick your own control set. If you are doing our framework, you are free to implement them to whatever interpretation makes sense, and you are able to prioritize it as you see fit. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly give a couple of examples of things that you might see in the framework just to give you a flavor of what all is included. I'm not going to go through all 16 musts. That's a different talk. Must 5 is that organizations must involve leadership in their cybersecurity decision making. This one I think is pretty straightforward, but it's a problem we see with a lot of organizations, is that leadership is just completely detached from cybersecurity, and that critical cybersecurity decisions are happening too buried in the organization for the key leadership to actually have a say in it. And I think naturally you can see the problems that this would bring up, but fundamentally it's a pretty basic principle that leadership are ultimately going to be responsible for the entire organization. They can delegate some stuff, but not everything can be delegated. So leadership has to be involved at least some level. But perhaps more importantly, leadership actually tends to be the people who have the power to can make these critical decisions about resources, about budget, or about personnel, which often are the limiters that we see. And also these people, senior leaders tend to be in the best position to actually make the decisions, to do the trading off between how much risk are we willing to take versus, how much, are we willing to invest. And that includes prioritizing cybersecurity. Another example is must 7. I mentioned this one already, but this one says organizations must establish a lead role with responsibilities to advise and provide services to the organization on cybersecurity matters. This is typically thought of as like a CISO, but whoever is in charge of the cybersecurity program, we call them the cybersecurity lead. There have been various titles, kind of some come in and out of fashion. But why is this a must? Fundamentally, cybersecurity is complex. It's changing. It's a challenging function for any organization. You need someone to be in charge of it. And cybersecurity has a big impact on organizations, and it can bring business to a halt. Must 12. Organizations must establish and maintain a cybersecurity budget. This is one that we often have to harp on because sometimes there is no budget. Sometimes the budget is like buried too deep within the IT budget or something like that. But fundamentally, this informs decision making. If you don't have a budget, you don't know how much you're spending. It's impossible to make good decisions to evaluate, are we spending enough? Are we spending more? The first question you would ask when posed with that question is, well, how much am I spending right now? And what am I getting for it? It also improves transparency and rigor. It makes it much more explicit. How much am I expending on cybersecurity? And that way you are actually able to get leadership to approve it. And finally, having a budget actually is a good way of showing an organizational commitment that you actually care about cybersecurity, that this is something that warrants separate consideration. And I think this is the last must highlight we have here, but this is must 15. And this one says organizations must adopt and use a baseline control set. Now, I think these slides might talk a little bit more about baseline control sets, but basically what we're talking about here is when you're making your control selection, which is, again, very important for cybersecurity, you shouldn't be doing it all on your own. You shouldn't be just deciding every single individual control that you think is best for you. That's one, it's wasted effort. You're probably going to miss important things. So we say you should adopt an established third-party control set. There are a lot of them out there. I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but you should pick one of them as your foundation for cybersecurity control selection. That way, you have a common language and structure. Again, it saves you resources because you're not doing ad hoc control selection or reinventing the wheel. Like I mentioned before, ad hoc control selection, there's a big risk of just gaps, right? Very likely to miss things if you're trying to reinvent the wheel on your own. And it provides you that broad baseline of protection. An important point about this one, though, is I mentioned that our framework is designed fundamentally to be flexible, to align to your mission. One, we don't tell you which controls to do. We just say, well, you have to adopt a third-party control set as your baseline. And we also don't say you have to strictly adhere to that baseline to a T. What we say is you have to use it as the foundation for your control selection. And then in cases where that foundation doesn't work for your mission, there's another must that basically says, well, you should then be able to pick additional or alternate controls to supplement and modify that baseline. So if all this sounds pretty good, then you can adopt. Adopting is super easy. This is a term that we use that just says you've decided you're going to make a commitment to use our framework as the foundation for your cybersecurity program. Doesn't mean that you are fully implementing all of the 16 musts. Like most likely, you're probably going to have some gaps, but by adopting, you have made that commitment. We have a badge you can download and put on your website that shows that we are trying to build our cybersecurity program with the Trusted CI framework. We also have a more in-depth guide called the Framework Implementation Guide. So you notice that all of the musts look like it's only one sentence. You might read some of those sentences and say, well, I'm not totally sure what that means. I'm not sure how I would begin implementing that for my organization. That's what the Framework Implementation Guide is for. This is an audience-specific deep dive into how to go about implementing the musts. The audience for our first Framework Implementation Guide is for research cyber infrastructure operators, or people who operate research cyber infrastructure. And it walks through in much greater detail how to go about implementing the musts, what the musts mean, why they are musts, and also identifies some common challenges that we see with organizations and how to address them. And if you have any experiences that you want to share with Trusted CI, any feedback you want to give us, feel free to reach out to us at framework@trustedci.org, because we love to hear feedback, both positive and negative. I just talked about the Framework Implementation Guide. We also have a number of templates and tools that we make freely available on our website. That's trustedci.org. And if you go there and you go to the framework page, there's a bunch of templates, including like a Master Information Security Policy and Procedures, or MISP, an Incident Response Policy template, a Cybersecurity Program Strategic Plan template, and a whole bunch of other ones. Okay, so moving away from just talking purely about the framework and talking a little bit about the Framework Cohort, this is a recent initiative that Trusted CI has taken on, basically starting in 2022. And I think I'm doing okay on time. All right, so just a little bit of context here. Trusted CI historically engaged with NSF major facilities and other NSF funded projects in a one-on-one basis. And so we would do what we call it an engagement. It would be a 6-month period. We would have a team from Trusted CI who would engage with the facility. And over that 6-month period, we would basically do an assessment. We would conduct discovery, doing fact finding, some back and forth there. We would write a report with recommendations on how to improve the cybersecurity posture of that project. We found this was very effective because it let us write very tailored recommendations for the people we were engaging with, but was not very time efficient, right? Because we could only do a couple every 6-month period. It was one per team. We could maybe support 2 or 3, just given the staffing that Trusted CI had. So starting this past year, we started a new cohort group engagement. I think that date is wrong. It should be 1H 2022. And so the idea of the cohort was, instead of engaging in this one-on-one manner, we would engage in a small group engagement. So 1-on-6 essentially. And the core structure here was we would engage for 6 months, same as before. We would have between 4 and 6, starting off with NSF major facilities, but we've slowly brought in that. And the goal here was framework adoption implementation. So we have a series of 6 monthly workshops. Each one's about 3 hours. And those workshops, they do a couple of things, but includes Trusted CI will train you on what each of the musts means, and then how to evaluate your own organization against that must. We also will have facilitated group discussions where you get to learn from the other cohort members. What are they doing? What are they struggling with? And then you get feedback from Trusted CI. Ultimately, we're leading toward developing a strategic plan. Probably we'll cover that in the next slide. And one of the big selling points here is that the time commitment is much lower than a full assessment. So at the end of the day, it's 3 hours for a month for 6 months, and then the time that we send away to basically do some internal discovery, or we'll lovingly call it homework, which ideally is no more than 4 to 8 hours a month. So the outcomes that you're driving toward with the framework cohort. The first one is that all of the organizations will have formally adopted the framework. Again, like we said, this is a commitment, so this is a pretty easy objective to obtain, but we're still going to count it. Once you've adopted, then the first thing we're doing is this program evaluation. So that's the first half of the cohort, essentially, is Trusted CI will train you on how to perform a self-assessment against yourself. You will then produce a self-assessment, and Trusted CI will validate it. So we call it a validated self-assessment against each of the 16 musts. Once you have that validated self-assessment in place, basically telling you where are you right now, how is your cybersecurity program doing right now, We then shift to strategic planning. And the strategic planning part says, you know where you are now, where are you going to be in the next 3 to 5 years? So we help each of the cohort members draft what we call a cybersecurity program strategic plan. This does a couple of things, but the ones I really want to emphasize are it explicitly connects cybersecurity to the mission. The very first thing in the strategic plan is, what is my organization's mission? And then you say, well, then how does cybersecurity support that mission? And then you ultimately drill down until you get to a series of strategic milestones you're going to try to achieve over the relevant period, whether it's 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, or even longer. A couple of lessons. So as of right now, we have completed one cohort. We call it Cohort Alpha now. That was the first 6 months of 2022, and we are about halfway through the second cohort, Cohort Bravo, which Scenic is a part of. But a couple of lessons learned from the first cohort. The process of self-assessing your programmatics across the board, all of the cohort members agreed was extremely valuable. One, they learned things about cybersecurity programs that they were less familiar with before, but also in answering the homework questions, they learned more about their own organizations, right? The act of doing discovery actually made them go and learn things that they maybe would not have learned otherwise. A couple of other things we've noted, though, is that even the most mature programs that we have been engaging with still have notable gaps on the programmatic side of things. And in some cases, there are organizations who had, even more gaps. The less mature ones obviously had more, but even the most mature still had some gaps that they needed to work on. A couple of areas are just common challenges. They're typically challenging in cybersecurity. One, we've got a must specifically about, we call it asset documentation, but people more familiar with cybersecurity might think of it, as inventories. Inventories are one of the fundamental cybersecurity controls, also a key programmatic enabler, and just a common challenge point. But also how you classify your assets is another area where there's common challenges there. Stakeholder management, both stakeholders and understanding your obligations. These are just areas that maybe are less familiar to the classic cybersecurity person. Some of the other common things we found, though, personnel tends to be the primary limiter, right? A lot of these organizations, they just don't have, the person power to actually implement all of the things that they need to do. So in some cases, they will say, oh, I know, I need to do, 500 things. I just don't have the people to go and do it. And so a lot of what we end up recommending when we ultimately give recommendations to these organizations, to their leadership, has to do with either personnel or funding. And finally, across the board, all the cohort members agreed that strategic planning initiative was extremely valuable and something that they were just not familiar with. This was an activity that was a little bit foreign to them, a bit more business school, a little bit less traditional cybersecurity, but the act of doing it really helped them think about cybersecurity priorities and also to communicate with their leadership much more effectively. Okay, so talking a little bit more about these strategic plans, we use the simple method, spent a little bit of time doing research on strategic planning, found out it's a huge field. We didn't want to get deep in the weeds, so we picked the simplest one. One of the key goals here I just mentioned is that the strategic plan really facilitates leadership involvement because it fundamentally connects cybersecurity outcomes to the highest level organizational mission, which is the thing that leadership is going to care the most about. In order to do that, there's a couple of steps that go into it, but basically you define what the organization's mission is. Then you say, well, then what is the cybersecurity program's mission supporting the organization's mission? And then you lay out a strategy to actually act on that. And then you move on to the specific milestones that you're actually going to try to achieve over the relevant period. Okay, I think that is the last of the slides. So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Hello? Yeah, okay, great. Scott, I'm going to go ahead and move the mic around the room and get questions. No, go ahead. Come on up.
Hi, Scott. Rick Wagner. I was a trusted CI fellow a couple of years ago. And first, to anyone who's listening, I will say that I found the framework to be exceptionally useful on an NIH project where I have to play the role of security officer, largely for what you laid out, which is the ability to deal with a high-level process, communication with stakeholders, et cetera. But I'm going to ask a question, and we'll see if this is outside your wheelhouse, because I absolutely was aiming it at Sean. So I'll come with a premise that might be a little bit chicken little. I think there is an existential risk to the open source software that is developed by and for the research communities. And this is because as software is being more strictly evaluated for deployment in data centers, in commercial areas, stuff like that, as much as we worry about the fundamental code being secure, the process by which it's developed, who has commit to the repos, how do we decide what's patched, do we have multi-factor on our package repositories, et cetera. I am concerned that literally the funding that goes towards the software will be wasted and the software will not make it into the hands of the researchers or other users. So looking at the framework, there are existing guidelines for the development of software. I'm specifically thinking of like the Open Source Software Foundation, and I'm wondering how to relate that. They have guidelines for developing software, there's badging. Do I label those as control sets, things that specifically we should do around the software? And then do you think the framework, the Trusted CI framework, is flexible enough that these projects that researchers engage in, and I'm active in the Jupyter community, could leverage the framework and then still do this to improve the security of the process by which the software is developed?
Yeah, really good question. And first, let me just say thanks for the kind words. I'm glad that you found the framework helpful in that context. We love to hear that. And maybe this is a better question for Sean. I'll absolutely take a stab at it, though. So totally agree. You know, the open source community definitely has its own unique security challenges. As for the specific guys you're talking about and how to characterize them, I think thinking them as a baseline control set absolutely could make sense. Without having them right in front of me, there might be some nuances there that we would have to hash out, but I think generally speaking, that's a good approach. As for the applicability of the framework to this community, I think it absolutely has the potential to apply. So the answer we'll always say is, if you need a cybersecurity program, then you should be using the Trusted CI framework. And that's our kind of like our easy answer because we want to, have a big tent. There are definitely some communities that have very unique needs, particularly in this case with regard to governance and resources. So when you have these highly distributed governance models, it just makes governance very difficult. And we've definitely seen this with some of the projects we're engaging with currently. So just as an example, in the NSF community, most of the time, the major facilities, the big telescopes and all that, they tend to have a pretty traditional organizational structure. But there are a couple, like there's the academic research fleet where it's, the NSF has a wide range of boats, and but their ownership is all over the place. Some of them are owned by the NSF, some of them are owned by the DoD, they have affiliated universities. It becomes very complex, and managing the governance considerations there can become much more difficult, particularly with regard to risk acceptance, who is actually empowered to accept risks on behalf of the project. If that is not in a traditional kind of hierarchical structure, it can become very challenging. I don't have like the perfect solution to open source security at this point. I absolutely think the framework should be a part of that conversation, and it's one of those areas where I mentioned we have currently a research framework implementation guide targeted at research cyber infrastructure. You could totally imagine that maybe the open source community has needs for its own targeted implementation guidance, because some of the must will probably be pretty straightforward, but some of them could be really messy, particularly on the governance questions. Hopefully that answered your question.
Well, I'll say yes. I've sat in on those calls about the academic research fleet. I think the governance analogy is highly similar because of the distributed nature. Fortunately, for better or worse, the open source software, we like to use that Berkeley license with the no warranty, so it's a little bit weird in terms of risk and liability, but thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you for that question. Yeah, thank you for that question. Anyone else, if you want to walk up to one of the mics here to ask questions, we have a few more minutes left in the session. While anybody's deciding to, Scott, I do have some questions possibly that you might be able to answer.
Sure.
Yeah, so are there any community listservs or channels available outside of the official cohort process for any peer interaction when an organization is looking to adopt the framework?
That's a really good question. So Trusted CI, we do have a community Slack that I believe is open to, I'm unfortunately, I don't have the specific answer, but I think it's open to anyone, definitely open to anyone who has NSF funding, but that would be one venue. Also, coming up in just the next month, we have the NSF Cybersecurity Summit. It's in October. Trusted CI leads that. That is, attendance, I think, is restricted to only NSF-funded projects, but you are able to view it remotely. Anyone in the world is able to view that remotely. Registration should be accessible on our website. I'm not sure if there are any other publicly. I guess I should also say Trusted CI has a community listserv where we will put out announcements relating to if there are updates to the framework, anything like that, just so you can basically be informed.
Great, thanks. Another question?
No, not a question.
Oh,
I highly recommend the Regulated Research Community of Practice, led by Carolyn Ellis. That is particularly a very open Slack community where you can ask questions like, I need to do incident response training, and somebody points you at the Black Hill Security card game, and next thing you know, you do your incident response tabletop. So Regulated Research Community of Practice would be my strong suggestion.
great. Thanks.
Yeah,
for
great
that.
addition.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, Scott, thank you very much for your session and description of the Trusted CI framework. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you for having me.